So I want to talk a little bit about technology too, because that does relate to literacy. So many of our children are spending their time on screens, sometimes doing activities that supposedly are related to education and learning and literacy, but often are really not that helpful. And we're living in a world where we have to deal with the fact that smartphone addiction is somewhat similar to processed food addiction, right? And the way that our bodies biologically are responding to screens is something that we need to be aware of. So what we're seeing in the world right now is a lot of behavior being driven by neuromodulators, right? Dopamine and serotonin, and the hits that we're getting in our brain every time we click on something and are watching something, that's influencing our behavior. And our unconscious mind is associating with being rewarded every time we do that, right? Every time that we engage a screen, we're rewarding ourselves with dopamine and other neuromodulators, and then that is establishing a feedback loop where we're more likely to keep doing that behavior. That's one way of describing addiction, right? And people talk about neuroplasticity like it's a good thing. I mean, neuroplasticity, brain plasticity is true. Our brains are always developing and adapting and creating new grooves. But whether that's good or bad depends on what you're reinforcing, right? So neuroplasticity and brain plasticity is a really terrible thing and can be a source of pathology. If you're training your brain to be addicted to screens, you're hardwiring your brain in that way. So you have to be thoughtful about what you're actually reinforcing in your behavior. So that habit development and developing healthy relationships to screen-based technology is a crucial thing for our postmodern and post-postmodern parenting world to be thinking about. And to connect the two, thinking about reading online versus reading books, Shallows is a great book that kind of goes through the history and the evolution of reading, and then gets into the difference between what's happening in your brain when you're reading a book versus what's happening in your brain when you're online clicking on stuff. It's two totally different realities in terms of what's happening neurologically. So slow reading leads to long-term memory, right? If you're actually reading a book, you're more likely to store that information in long-term memory. If you're engaged in incessant online media, you're experiencing cognitive overload, and that information is not being stored in your long-term memory as much, especially if you're also not having downtime to not be doing much, like maybe taking a walk in the park, where you can actually be processing the information that you just exposed yourself to so that it can be stored in long-term memory. So if it's go, go, go all the time, it's like in one ear, out the other kind of thing. So we're at a pivotal point in our history right now where we are developing what our relationship will be to these screen-based technologies. And we're living in a world where the norm is becoming continuous partial attention, right? Like people, it's getting harder and harder to just be fully present because we are training ourselves not to be fully present. And just to be clear, the research has been clear on this for a while, right? Like the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 0 screen time for children under the age of 2. And for children 3 to 15, 18, it should be less than 2 hours a day, right? And so and yet we live in a world where the average American spends 8.5 hours a day looking at a screen. We need to be thinking about it. And as kids get older, of course, that screen time, it depends what you're doing. So not all screen time is equal. You can be writing. I mean, right now, like writing is going to be taking place on a screen once you get older. But a lot of informational technologies are framed as educational technologies, especially for young children, and they're just not. So my focus really when I'm thinking about this is young children, and there's really not much of a benefit and a big downside for children under the age of 10 to be using screens. And the popular justifications for that are actually pretty silly when you think about it. Like we have these narratives that we're preparing our children for the future, but the apps that they're using on their iPad are not relevant to what they're going to be doing as 20 and 30-year-olds. We don't even know what technology they're going to have access to, right? It's just a really bad argument. And also, it is great that we have, in some ways, we can outsource our memory to technology, so we have access to information. But what is determining how we're using that technology? What is determining what we're using Google for is the process of education that we've gone through, and the amount of knowledge that we actually have in our long-term memory is going to impact who we are and our self-concept and the things that we're interested in and the things we're even going to use technology for. So we need to be focused on how we develop minds who are going to use technology in pro-social ways, as opposed to linking people up with technology which is just going to lead to sort of undeveloped ways of using it, right? So the focus, again, should be on human development. So again, just thinking about this technology piece more, and also one thing that's really prevalent in our society is this metaphor of like the brain in a computer. And I want to actually take some time to unpack that, because the mind-brain interface is much more like a complex ecosystem than it is like a machine, right? So a computer is a complicated machine, but it is not a complex system, right? It's not growing, changing, adapting. It's not in relationship to its environment, but people are, right? So if you think of children or brains like a computer, then you're thinking of them as passive and programmable, right? But they're not. They're active and they're autonomously growing. If you're thinking of us as computers or machines, you're thinking of us as though variability and diversity is a problem to be fixed, right? But it's not. Variability in children should be expected and is the result of dynamic growth and organization. If you're thinking about quality in terms of a single metric like IQ, you've really missed the mark, because the quality of someone's mind can be represented in various different ways. So you can't reduce it in the way that you can reduce a machine. And if schools are like computer factories or repair shops, and students are designed and repaired based on set standards, that's a very different model of education than if schools are like conservation areas to protect an ecosystem, right? So I think the model of a complex ecosystem is actually much more empowering and much more research-based. So we don't want to kind of reduce what we are to the technology that we're interacting with. It's almost like we're starting to think of ourselves more like computers now that we're becoming addicted to using computers. So we need to kind of break free of that. And another piece to mention is that technology cannot replace teachers, right? Technology and screens can replace books and chalkboards, maybe, but not human beings. And we're almost thinking about technology as though we won't need the human relationships anymore that education is all about, and we need to just fundamentally not fall into that trap and put technology in its place. Yes, we can get rid of textbooks and chalkboards maybe, and we can have more digital ways of interfacing with information. But the context of human relationships is not something that can be changed without fundamentally altering our developmental process, right? So there is this evolutionary mismatch between our brain and our species and modern society, and we need to start thinking about what we need to do to be healthy, right? Nature nurtures, and kids need downtime, right? And more time in nature leads to a decrease in depression and anxiety, an increase in concentration and creativity and memory. Time in nature enables the ecosystem of your mind and brain to actually attune to and become resonant with and integrated with the ecosystem of the earth. And if we're going to be having people raising children who are going to take care of the earth, they need to have an actual connection to the earth and experiencing themselves as biological beings that actually depend on an ecosystem to literally keep them alive. And we're so disconnected, it's like we don't even think of ourselves as animals anymore. We are animals who literally ground to the earth through electromagnetic energy in our bodies, right? Like there's a lot of research being done on what our physical connection is to the earth and how we are part of this broader ecosystem. We are a complex system embedded in other overlapping complex systems, and that's the kind of framework that we need to have if we're really going to grok how to have a better relationship to our environment.